Hi guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of the most difficult and forgotten campaigns of the Second World War. We often hear about the beaches of Normandy or the frozen fields of Russia, but Italy was its own kind of battlefield, one of mountains, ruins and endless rain. For German soldiers it was a place of exhaustion, where every step forward meant climbing, and every night was haunted by the sound of distant guns. This story will slowly take us there, so you can feel what it meant to fight in Italy. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. The campaign in Italy for German soldiers began not with glory, but with a long retreat and a struggle to hold ground that seemed impossible to defend. When the Allies landed in Sicily in the summer of 1943, it marked the start of a campaign that would last nearly 2 years, a campaign of mountains, valleys and towns turned into fortresses. For those who wore the field grey uniform, Italy was not the sunny land of postcards, but a harsh and punishing battlefield. Soldiers who had already fought in Russia or France suddenly found themselves facing not just an enemy with overwhelming resources, but also the unforgiving landscape of Italy itself. Hills were steep, roads narrow, and weather unpredictable. Many young men wrote home that they feared the rain more than the bullets, because mud could trap vehicles, soak clothes, and leave men shivering for days without relief. To fight in Italy meant carrying heavy packs up rocky slopes where mules often replaced trucks, and where each step felt like a battle of its own. When soldiers first arrived, they were struck by the beauty of the countryside. Olive trees, vineyards, villages clinging to hillsides, but beauty quickly turned into danger. Every village could hide an ambush, every stone wall could conceal a sniper. At night, the air filled with the croaking of frogs and the rustle of leaves, but also with the sharp crack of distant rifles. Men tried to sleep on the hard ground, helmets still strapped on, boots never removed, because alarms came without warning. A soldier in Italy learned to live half awake, listening for the faintest sound that might mean movement in the dark. Food was another challenge. Supplies had to move through narrow mountain passes, always under threat of Allied bombers. Sometimes soldiers ate nothing but dry bread and thin soup for days, washing it down with cold water from mountain streams. In villages they might find a little wine, but even that was rationed and shared. Letters from home became treasures, read and reread under the flicker of candlelight, reminding them of a world far away from mud and fire. The fighting itself was unlike anything many of them had experienced before. The Allies advanced slowly, not because they lacked strength, but because every hill had to be stormed, every river crossed under fire, every stone farmhouse defended. For the Germans, it meant turning ruins into strong points, digging into caves and bunkers, and holding positions until ordered to withdraw. Retreat was common, but it never felt like escape. It was just the next position, the next line, the next night of waiting for the storm to come again. There was no sense of sweeping victory here, only survival. The weather too was an enemy. In winter, cold rains turned the valleys into seas of mud, and snow capped the peaks. In summer, heat pressed down with merciless weight, and soldiers marched under the blazing sun, sweat stinging their eyes, uniforms sticking to their skin. Yet battles came all the same, indifferent to the season. To fight in Italy meant never being able to rest fully, never escaping the pull of the land itself, which seemed to resist every army that entered it. Soldiers often spoke of the silence between battles, a silence that was almost heavier than the fighting. It was in those moments, sitting on a hillside or in a trench carved from rock, that the mind wandered home. Some men dreamed of their families, others of peace, others simply of a warm bed and a night without fear. Yet dawn always came, and with it, orders, movement, the clank of equipment, and the slow climb toward another unknown village, another nameless hill. The campaign in Italy was not a story of glory, but of endurance. For German soldiers it was a test of patience, strength, and spirit, stretched across months of hardship. And so, as our story begins, imagine yourself not as a distant observer, but as one of those men, young, tired, carrying a rifle up a narrow path, the smell of wet earth in your nose, the weight of the unknown in your chest. This is what it meant to fight in Italy. For German soldiers in Italy, the first weeks of fighting felt like stepping into another world, one where nature itself conspired against them. Unlike the wide fields of Russia or the flat plains of France, the Italian landscape forced everything into a slower, heavier rhythm. Roads twisted endlessly through mountains, and every bend seemed to hide danger. Soldiers quickly discovered that the land was as much an enemy as the Allied troops. Trucks broke down, supplies lagged behind, and sometimes mules became the only way to move food or ammunition up the steep paths. Rain was constant, and when it fell, entire valleys turned to rivers of mud. A soldier might spend hours pulling a cart from a ditch, only to march through water that soaked his boots and left his feet raw. Some men joked bitterly that the mud was stronger than the Allies because it clung to everything and never let go. At night, tents were rare. More often, soldiers slept in ruined farmhouses or dugouts scratched into hillsides. The smell of smoke, damp clothes and wet earth was constant, mixing with the faint aroma of olives or grapes from abandoned vineyards. Sleep never lasted long. The rumble of artillery or the roar of planes often tore men from their brief rest. Sometimes it was only distant thunder, but no one dared relax fully, because thunder and guns could sound the same. Daily life blurred into a cycle of marching, digging, waiting and listening. Meals came late, if at all, and usually meant thin soup, bread hard as stone, and perhaps a bit of tinned meat. When luck allowed, soldiers found fruit in orchards, but even that felt like stolen moments of comfort in a world that offered little kindness. Letters from home were passed hand to hand, often read aloud to comrades who had none of their own. They carried more warmth than any blanket, reminding men of mothers, wives, or children far away. Fighting itself came suddenly, often after hours of silence. A patrol might vanish into the hills and return with nothing but tired faces, or sometimes not return at all. When battles erupted, they were brutal but short, ending in a retreat to yet another line. Soldiers grew used to leaving behind trenches they had built, bunkers they had defended, even comrades they could not carry. It created a feeling of impermanence, as if nothing in Italy belonged to them except the weight of their gear and the weariness in their bones. Still they obeyed orders, because that was all they could do. Many young men were only 18 or 19, far from home for the first time, and the war in Italy quickly stripped away any illusions of adventure. What remained was endurance, the will to take another step, to hold another hill, to survive another night. To fight in Italy was to live in a constant state of waiting. Waiting for supplies, for dawn, for the next order, for the moment when silence would break into fire once again. By the autumn of 1943, German soldiers learned that the campaign in Italy was unlike any other front they had known. The mountains acted as natural fortresses, and commanders ordered units to turn every ridge, every farmhouse, every stone wall into a defensive position. The Allies advanced slowly, but their power was overwhelming. Endless artillery, waves of aircraft, and fresh divisions landing on the shores. For the soldiers in grey, the task was simple yet exhausting. Hold the line as long as possible, then withdraw to the next prepared position. It became a rhythm of resistance and retreat, one that wore down even the most disciplined men. When orders came to abandon a village, the soldiers left behind not only trenches but also memories of sleepless nights and comrades lost. Sometimes civilians watched them go, faces unreadable, torn between fear and resentment. The war turned once peaceful valleys into scars of rubble and smoke, and soldiers often felt as though the land itself was dissolving under their boots. Marches grew longer and supplies thinner. Food arrived late, uniforms wore out, and boots split from endless climbing. Water was sometimes scarce. other times flooding from storms that washed out entire roads. In letters, men admitted their greatest enemy was not always the Allied soldier, but exhaustion itself. Some had fought in Russia and said Italy demanded a different kind of endurance, not against bitter cold, but against endless strain on body and spirit. Each new defensive line meant digging trenches in rocky soil, building shelters from stones, carrying heavy weapons up slopes that even mules struggled to climb. Night patrols were especially feared. Moving through olive groves or chestnut forests in silence, every sound seemed magnified. The snap of a twig, the clink of metal. Soldiers walked with rifles ready, nerves stretched thin, knowing that the darkness could erupt into sudden gunfire at any moment. Yet there were also moments of strange calm. A quiet sunrise over misty hills, a pause in the shelling, a loaf of bread shared among comrades. These moments reminded men that they were still human, not just shadows in an endless war. But peace never lasted long. Orders always came, hold here, delay there, retreat again. And so the cycle continued, leaving men weary but hardened, tied to a land that seemed to resist them at every step. To fight in Italy was to fight not only the enemy, but also the mountains, the weather, and the creeping sense that the campaign would never end. Winter came early to the Italian mountains, and with it a new kind of struggle. For German soldiers, the cold was not as deadly as on the Eastern Front, but it seeped into bones all the same, carried by endless rain and sudden snowstorms. Trenches filled with water, dugouts collapsed under the weight of wet earth, and blankets never seemed to dry. Soldiers huddled together for warmth, their breath turning to mist in the frosty air. Fires were dangerous, for smoke betrayed positions, so most nights men shivered in silence, pulling greatcoats tighter and dreaming of warm stoves back home. Even simple tasks like cooking became trials. Bread hardened quickly, and soup froze in thin layers before it could be eaten. Water from streams had to be melted from ice, or filtered through cloth to avoid sickness. Supplies moved slower than ever, because roads turned into slick ribbons of mud or vanished under snow. Convoys stalled, mules slipped, and entire battalions went hungry while waiting for relief. Some soldiers joked bitterly that they fought three enemies, the Allies, the mountains, and the weather never surrendered. Combat during winter was often sudden and short. Patrols stumbled through fog, exchanging brief bursts of fire before vanishing into the white silence. Artillery echoed strangely in the mountains, thunder rolling across valleys and shaking the ground beneath frozen boots. When shells struck, snow flew like dust, covering helmets and weapons in a fine powder. Men dug shelters deeper into rock, their hands raw and blistered from picks and shovels. But still the cold crept in. Letters from home arrived, damp and smudged, yet they were read with care, carried close to the heart as if they gave warmth of their own. Commanders spoke of holding lines until spring, of delaying the Allies at all costs. For the ordinary soldier, this meant long nights of listening for footsteps in the snow, long days of watching white hills that seemed both beautiful and cruel. Sometimes, when the sky cleared, the mountains glittered under the sun, a sight almost too peaceful to believe it belonged to a battlefield. Yet peace was an illusion. Within hours, guns would sound again, and soldiers would rise from their frozen shelters to fight once more. To endure winter in Italy was to fight a war within a war, a battle against cold, hunger and despair, where every dawn felt like survival itself. Spring brought little relief to the German soldiers in Italy. The snow melted, but in its place came floods and mudslides that swallowed roads and turned fields into swamps. Trenches collapsed, dugouts filled with water, and boots grew heavy with clinging mud. Soldiers spent hours repairing shelters, only to see them washed away again by sudden rains. The change in weather also brought an increase in fighting, for the Allies used every dry day to press their advantage. The German lines were tested constantly, with artillery pounding ridges and aircraft circling above, searching for columns of men or supplies to strike. Every movement became dangerous, every march a gamble. Yet spring also carried strange moments of beauty. Hillsides blossomed with wildflowers, birds returned to the skies, and in the quiet before dawn the land looked almost untouched by war. Some soldiers allowed themselves a moment to breathe, to watch the mist lift from valleys and imagine peace. But such thoughts never lasted long. Orders always came to move, to prepare, to hold another line. And with the thaw, Allied attacks grew sharper. Rivers that once offered protection now had to be crossed, and each crossing meant a deadly struggle. Engineers built makeshift bridges under fire while infantry waded through water up to their waists, weapons held above their heads. The current was strong, the banks steep, and many men never reached the far side. Those who survived carried the memory of icy water, heavy gear, and the fear of being swept away. Villages, too, became battlegrounds. Houses turned into fortresses, with walls punched through to allow movement between rooms, and cellars used as firing points. Civilians often fled, but some remained, trapped between armies. Soldiers remembered their faces, worn, silent, carrying both sorrow and defiance. To fight in a village meant room-to-room combat, smoke filling the air, the sound of boots echoing on stone floors. When the battle ended, the village was often reduced to rubble, leaving only broken walls and empty streets. In those ruins, soldiers rested briefly, eating cold rations before moving on again. Spring also meant longer days, and with them, longer marches. The sun grew hotter, uniforms stuck to sweaty skin, and canteens emptied quickly. Water was often dirty or scarce, leading to sickness that weakened entire companies. Still, the campaign pressed on. For the German soldier, spring in Italy was not a season of renewal, but another stage of hardship, another reminder that the war would not release its grip. Survival meant pushing through mud, crossing rivers, and enduring battles that seemed to erase the very land beneath their feet. By the summer of 1944, the German soldiers in Italy were seasoned by hardship, yet exhaustion never left them. The heat pressed down like a hammer, baking the rocky hillsides until the ground itself seemed to burn through boots. Dust rose with every step, clinging to uniforms, mixing with sweat, and filling throats until men coughed dryly with no water left to swallow. Rivers shrank, streams dried, and canteens felt lighter than ever. Soldiers marched under the glaring sun, rifles heavy across their shoulders, helmets hot as kettles. Every climb up a slope meant lungs burning and legs trembling, yet there was no choice but to continue. The Allied push was relentless, and commanders demanded positions be held at all costs. Villages offered little shelter, for walls radiated heat, and the smell of decay clung to the streets where animals and sometimes even men lay unburied under rubble. In the rare shade of olive trees, soldiers rested briefly, sharing what little water remained, sometimes passing a single cigarette between 3 or 4 men. Heat brought another enemy, disease. Flies swarmed around camps, food spoiled quickly, and stomach illnesses spread through exhausted companies. Medical supplies were scarce, and the few doctors could only offer rest that never came. Despite sickness, the fighting continued. Each day felt like an endless march uphill, and each night ended with soldiers too tired to speak, collapsing on the ground without removing boots or gear. Yet there were fleeting moments of humanity. In certain villages, civilians offered water or bread, though always with fear in their eyes. Some soldiers remembered kind gestures, an old woman handing a cup of cool water, children waving timidly from doorways, before gunfire drove them forward again. The beauty of Italy never vanished, but it became surreal, almost cruel to see golden fields and clear skies while shells exploded in the distance. Battles often began suddenly, with Allied artillery pounding ridges before infantry advanced. The German defence relied on small groups hidden in stone houses, caves, or vineyards, holding out as long as possible before retreating again. Retreat was not shame, but survival, and every step back meant another line to prepare, another hill to defend. For many soldiers, summer in Italy blurred into one long march of dust, heat, and exhaustion. When they closed their eyes at night, they no longer dreamed of home, but only of water, shade, and the silence of a world without guns. To fight in Italy during summer was to feel the weight of war in every breath, every heartbeat, every blistered step forward. As 1944 moved forward, German soldiers in Italy found themselves part of a campaign that seemed endless, a slow grind of defence and withdrawal that tested body and spirit. The mountains and valleys were no longer just scenery. They had become walls and traps, shaping every movement and battle. Soldiers learned to measure time not by days or months, but by lines of defence. One ridge, then another, each carrying memories of struggle and loss. The Allies pressed on with constant artillery, air raids, and armoured advances, and yet progress was measured in metres rather than miles. For the German units, the mission was clear: delay, weaken, and retreat only when absolutely necessary. This meant digging in wherever possible, turning caves into shelters and vineyards into strongpoints. Men carried shovels almost as often as rifles, because survival depended on how fast they could carve trenches into stony soil. Every hour spent digging was an hour stolen from rest, but without cover, there was no chance of withstanding the bombardments that came daily. The sound of artillery became part of life, distant thunder at first, then the rising whistle, and finally the crash that shook the earth and left ears ringing. Soldiers flinched less over time, but their nerves never truly healed. Marching from one position to another was exhausting beyond words. Boots wore thin, packs grew heavier, and the dust of summer turned into the mud of autumn rains. Each step forward or back felt the same, as if the war circled endlessly with no way out. Illness added to the toll. Dysentery, fevers, and infections spread through ranks where hygiene was impossible to maintain. Men grew thinner, their faces lined with exhaustion that made 19-year-olds look twice their age. Yet even in this hardship, moments of quiet appeared. A sunrise over misty hills, a loaf of bread shared in silence, or the soft sound of church bells ringing from a distant village reminded them of the world beyond the front. Some soldiers admitted they clung to these fragments, because without them, the war felt like an endless night. Still, duty called them back. When orders came to retreat again, they packed their gear, left behind what could not be carried, and marched once more toward another uncertain line. To fight in Italy meant adapting to a rhythm of struggle that seemed unbreakable, where the land itself demanded endurance, and survival was measured not in victories but in the ability to rise each morning and face another day of the same unending war. By late 1944, the campaign in Italy had become a test of pure endurance. German soldiers were no longer surprised by hardship. They expected it, lived within it, and carried it like a second uniform. Yet each new line they were ordered to hold seemed more difficult than the last. The terrain grew harsher as units moved deeper into the Apennine Mountains, where steep ridges and deep valleys shaped every decision. The Allies had overwhelming artillery and air superiority, but the land itself slowed them, and it was this natural barrier that gave German soldiers the chance to resist. Holding a ridge meant climbing paths so narrow that mules often slipped, sending precious supplies crashing into the ravines. Soldiers carried shells on their backs, stumbling over rocks, every trip upward feeling like a punishment. Once in position, they built defences from whatever they could find: stones stacked into walls, logs dragged from forests, sandbags filled with mud. They knew the enemy would come eventually, and every shovel of dirt was a bet against death. When battles erupted, the mountains amplified the violence. Gunfire cracked across valleys, artillery echoed like thunder rolling from peak to peak, and aircraft dropped bombs that shook the ground, until soldiers felt as though the earth itself might give way. At night, the cold settled in with biting force. Men wrapped themselves in coats stiff with sweat and dirt, huddling in caves or dugouts to escape the freezing wind. Fires were forbidden for fear of detection, so warmth came only from the press of bodies or the memory of sunlight. Food remained scarce, often little more than bread, thin soup or dried vegetables. Water was collected from streams, icy and sharp, and every swallow reminded soldiers of the mountains that surrounded them. The sense of isolation grew heavier with each passing week. Letters from home arrived rarely, sometimes months late, the paper already yellowed from travel. When they came, men read them again and again until the words blurred in the dark. Between battles, silence was thick. It weighed on soldiers as heavily as combat, because in that silence lay uncertainty, the knowledge that the enemy was waiting, preparing, advancing. Yet even in this bleakness, men found small anchors of humanity. They carved names into rocks, sang songs quietly at night, or scratched notes in battered diaries. These moments did not erase the war, but they reminded soldiers they were still alive. To fight in Italy by late 1944 was to exist in a rhythm of exhaustion, fear, and fleeting hope, where each sunrise meant survival and each sunset meant one more night endured. As winter approached again in 1944, German soldiers in Italy braced themselves for another season of hardship. The cold rains returned first, drenching uniforms, soaking trenches, and turning paths into streams of mud. Then came the snow, covering hillsides in white silence that seemed peaceful until the first shell shattered it. Soldiers moved slower than ever, carrying heavy packs through drifts that reached their knees. The mountains, already unforgiving, became nearly impassable. Supply lines broke down, and sometimes whole units went days with little more than stale bread and thin coffee. Wet clothes froze stiff, and men awoke with frost clinging to blankets, their breath rising in clouds that hung low over the dugouts. Fires were rare and dangerous, for smoke betrayed positions, yet without them frostbite spread quickly. To endure winter meant finding warmth in the smallest ways, pressing together in narrow shelters, wrapping scarves tighter, or simply moving to keep blood flowing. Combat did not pause for weather. The Allies launched attacks even in snowstorms, using artillery to smash German lines before sending patrols forward. The echoes of battle carried farther in the frozen air, each explosion sounding closer than it was. Night patrols were the most dreaded, for snow-muffled footsteps, and enemies could appear suddenly from the mist. Soldiers described walking in silence, rifles ready, their nerves stretched to breaking, unsure if the shadows around them were friends or foes. The strain of constant vigilance left men hollow-eyed, their faces gaunt beneath steel helmets. Illness spread quickly, pneumonia, fevers, infections that the few medical staff could hardly treat. Yet despite suffering, orders were strict. Hold every ridge, every village, delay the enemy as long as possible. For many, it felt less like fighting a campaign and more like clinging to survival against both man and nature. Civilians, too, suffered in this season, and soldiers sometimes shared rations with hungry children or accepted bread from families who had nothing left. These brief exchanges reminded them of humanity, but they were fleeting, swallowed again by the cold weight of war. Winter in Italy was not the endless nightmare of the Russian front, yet it carried its own cruelty, one of rain, snow, hunger, and silence. To fight through it was to feel trapped in a world where warmth and peace belonged to another life entirely. By early 1945, the German soldiers in Italy had grown accustomed to a life where exhaustion never lifted. The front was not fast-moving. It crept forward, line by line, ridge by ridge. For those in the ranks, it felt endless, a rhythm of digging, marching, waiting, and fighting. The Allied forces had more men, more planes, and more artillery, yet the mountains slowed them, and this delay became the Germans' grim duty. Each new position meant another climb, another set of trenches carved into rock, another chance to face bombardments that shook the earth. Artillery was the true master of this campaign. Hours passed under shell fire, the sky tearing open with whistling shrieks before the ground erupted in flame. Men pressed into the dirt, praying their shelter held. When silence returned, ears rang, nerves frayed, and the air smelled of smoke and dust. After such attacks, survivors emerged like shadows, brushing dirt from helmets, counting losses quietly. Combat with infantry followed, but often the bombardments alone broke morale. Despite all this, soldiers learned to endure. They carried shovels as faithfully as rifles, repaired trenches after every storm of shells, and moved again when ordered. The constant retreat felt like an endless backward march, yet obedience left no room for refusal. Nights were the hardest. Darkness in the mountains was deep, broken only by distant flares or the soft glimmer of villages far below. Soldiers lay awake listening to the sounds of the front, the bark of machine guns, the whistle of shells, the rustle of boots on frozen soil. Sleep came in fragments, broken by sudden alarms. Rations grew fewer as supply lines faltered. Meals often meant a piece of bread, sometimes mouldy, or thin soup barely warm. Cigarettes became rare treasures, traded among comrades or saved for moments before battle. Illness lingered in every camp. Coughs echoed through dugouts. Fevers weakened men already worn thin by cold and hunger. And yet, even in this grim world, small moments of humanity survived. A shared story, a song hummed under breath, a sunrise painting the peaks with gold. Such things reminded soldiers that life still existed beyond the battlefield. Still, war always returned. Orders never ceased, and each dawn brought movement, struggle, and uncertainty. To fight in Italy by 1945 was to live on the edge of collapse, sustained only by discipline, habit, and the faint hope that someday the march would finally end. For many German soldiers, life in Italy by the spring of 1945 was defined by a sense of waiting. Waiting for the next order, the next bombardment, the next retreat. The campaign had stretched on for nearly 2 years, and every man felt the weight of it in his bones. The land itself seemed weary of war. Villages stood in ruins, vineyards torn apart by shell fire, hills scarred with trenches and craters. Yet the fighting did not stop. Allied forces pressed forward with growing strength, their supply lines strong, their air power unmatched. German units, though battered, were still commanded to hold every possible ridge and delay the inevitable. For soldiers in the ranks, this meant another season of endurance. Trenches dug in rocky soil filled with water from spring rains, collapsing into muddy pits that soaked boots and chilled bodies. Dugouts smelled of damp wood, smoke, and unwashed uniforms. Nights were long, broken by the whistle of shells or the sudden crack of rifles echoing across valleys. In the silence between attacks, soldiers lay awake, minds drifting toward home, toward memories of warmth and peace that felt more like dreams than reality. Supplies grew scarcer as the months passed. Bread was harder, soup thinner, meat almost non-existent. Hunger gnawed at men who marched for hours carrying weapons and gear that seemed heavier with every step. Cigarettes, once common, became priceless, sometimes traded for food or treasured as comfort on nights before battles. Illness continued to spread, fevers and coughs that no medicine could cure in the field. Still, men carried on, because to stop meant to fall behind, and falling behind meant being left to fate. Encounters with civilians were fewer now, as many villages had been abandoned or destroyed. Those who remained were thin, silent and distant, their lives torn apart by years of war. Soldiers sometimes shared rations with children, but even such gestures could not erase the bitterness in the air. Yet amid the ruin, the land still offered moments of beauty. At dawn, mist curled through valleys, the sun rose over olive groves and the mountains glowed in soft light. For brief moments, men could forget the war, if only to remember it again when the first shells fell. Fighting in Italy at this stage was not about victories or defeats, but about survival, about holding out for one more day, One more night, against both the enemy and the weight of despair. Every sunrise was proof of endurance, every sunset a quiet reminder that the struggle was far from over. By the spring of 1945, German soldiers in Italy lived in a strange state between exhaustion and routine. They had long since learned that the campaign was not one of swift victories, but of endless defence, where every hill had to be fought for and every valley crossed under fire. Orders rarely promised hope. They simply demanded delay, endurance, and sacrifice. The soldiers carried out those orders because there was no alternative, though many wondered how much longer their strength would last. The terrain shaped every movement. Narrow paths wound between mountains, forcing long marches under the watchful eye of Allied planes. Trucks often could not pass, and supplies lagged, so men carried crates of ammunition and food on their backs, stumbling over rocks and roots. Each climb felt heavier than the last, and the thought of another ridge beyond the one they just reached sapped morale. In those mountains, even silence was heavy. At night the wind whispered through the trees, and every rustle could be a patrol. Soldiers slept in short bursts, helmets close at hand, rifles resting against their shoulders. Dreams were rare, and when they came, they were often of home. Warm kitchens, family voices, quiet streets untouched by war. Waking from such dreams was painful, for the cold air and the weight of gear reminded them instantly where they were. Combat was sudden and violent. Allied artillery pounded ridges with precision, scattering stones and soil like rain, and when infantry advanced, the Germans answered from their dugouts and stone shelters. Firing positions were close, sometimes only a field or a wall apart. The smell of smoke and gunpowder hung in the air for hours, and when the noise finally ceased, only silence and the wounded remained. Retreats came often, but they were not escapes. Only movements to the next line, the next defence, the next night of waiting. Food was poor, often little more than bread, watery soup or coffee brewed from roasted barley. Cigarettes, when found, were shared with quiet gratitude, a brief comfort before duty resumed. Illness remained constant, with fevers and stomach sickness spreading easily in damp trenches. Yet men endured, because they had no choice. Among comrades, small bonds gave strength. A joke told in darkness, a song hummed under breath, a letter read aloud. These fragile moments reminded them that they were still human in a world determined to strip them of that truth. To fight in Italy in 1945 was not to chase victory, but to resist collapse, to endure a campaign that demanded everything and offered nothing in return but survival for another day. By April 1945, the German soldiers in Italy sensed the end was near, though no one knew what form it would take. Rumours drifted through the ranks of Allied breakthroughs, of collapsing fronts, of surrender elsewhere, but orders still demanded resistance. Men obeyed, not from belief in victory, but from habit, discipline, and the bond with comrades beside them. The land around them bore scars of years of war. Villages were shells of stone, bridges lay shattered in rivers, and fields once green with crops were now littered with barbed wire and craters. Soldiers no longer saw beauty in these hills. They saw only obstacles, each one waiting to be fought over. Days were long marches under a heavy sun, sweat stinging their eyes, dust rising in clouds that clung to uniforms. Nights were filled with cold winds and the distant thunder of artillery. Supplies had grown scarcer than ever. Bread was rationed into tiny portions, soup so thin it barely warmed the body. Meat was a memory, and cigarettes a rare treasure passed carefully between hands. Hunger gnawed constantly, weakening men who already staggered under exhaustion. Some grew ill and never recovered, left behind in makeshift hospitals or carried on stretchers by comrades too weary to speak. Yet the campaign pressed on. Each new order brought them to another ridge, another line to defend. Allied firepower was overwhelming, their aircraft filling the skies by day, and their artillery shaking the ground by night. German soldiers dug deeper into hillsides, carving shelters from rock, their hands blistered from shovels, their bodies coated in dust and sweat. Fear became a constant companion, but so too did numbness. Many men admitted they no longer felt shock at shell fire. It was simply the rhythm of life. When silence came, it was almost worse, for it left space for thoughts of home. Letters were rare, sometimes months old when they finally arrived, yet they were read over and over, each word carrying the warmth of a world far away. Among comrades, bonds grew stronger. A piece of bread shared, a story whispered in the dark, a hand steadying another during a march. Such moments gave strength when nothing else did. To fight in Italy in April 1945 was to live in a world stripped down to survival, where the only certainty was another dawn of struggle. Men marched and fought not for glory or hope, but for each other, holding on until the very end. By the final weeks of the war in Italy, German soldiers were moving through a landscape that felt more like ruin than country. Every road was scarred by bomb craters, every bridge reduced to twisted metal or shattered stone, and villages were often nothing more than hollow walls. The campaign that had begun with the promise of defending Italy had turned into a slow, grinding retreat northward, step by step, valley by valley. Soldiers carried the weight of endless marches, their boots worn thin, uniforms patched with whatever cloth could be found, faces drawn and hollow from months of hunger. Many were still little more than boys, though their eyes had aged beyond recognition. The Allies pushed forward with overwhelming force, their planes circling overhead from dawn to dusk, their artillery shaking the ground with relentless fire. German units dug in where they could, carving shelters into hillsides or hiding in the rubble of abandoned houses. Every day brought new shelling, every night the dread of patrols slipping through the dark. Some men had long since lost the belief that they were holding the front. They knew they were only delaying the inevitable, yet they obeyed orders, not out of conviction, but out of habit, fear of punishment, and loyalty to comrades who depended on one another to survive. Hunger was constant. Rations shrank to crusts of bread, thin soup, and sometimes nothing at all. Soldiers scoured fields for anything edible. Wild greens, chestnuts, or fruit left behind in orchards. Illness spread quickly, and without medicine many simply grew weaker until they could no longer march. Yet the campaign demanded movement, and so they pressed on, one weary step after another. Among civilians there was little warmth left. Years of war had taken too much. Some villagers watched silently as soldiers passed, others turned away, bitterness etched on their faces. Still, there were fleeting moments when humanity broke through. A child offering water, an old man pointing toward a safer path, a loaf of bread shared in secret. These gestures, rare as they were, lingered in memory longer than any battle. By this stage, the land itself seemed exhausted. Spring brought blossoms to fields and hills, but soldiers no longer had the strength to admire them. They marched past beauty without seeing it, eyes fixed on the road ahead, minds dulled by fatigue. To fight in Italy at the end of the war was to exist in a haze of ruin, hunger, and silence, where the only goal was to endure until the march finally stopped. As April 1945 turned into its final days, the German soldiers in Italy could feel the war closing in around them. News filtered through in fragments. Defeats in the north, advances elsewhere, rumours of surrender. None of it was official, yet every man sensed the truth. Their commanders still issued orders to hold ground, to resist, to delay, but the weight of these words no longer carried belief. Soldiers obeyed because obedience had been carved into them, but deep down they knew the end was near. The landscape reflected this final struggle. Fields were marked by craters, hills scarred with trenches that no longer held meaning, and villages stood as empty shells echoing with silence. Each march forward seemed more futile, yet it continued because there was nothing else to do. Exhaustion was complete. Boots split apart, socks were worn through, and many soldiers wrapped their feet in rags to keep walking. Uniforms hung loosely from bodies thinned by hunger, patched again and again until the original fabric was almost gone. Weapons were carried more from duty than confidence, for ammunition was low and resupply almost non-existent. Meals were reduced to scraps, a piece of bread, a handful of dried beans, sometimes nothing but water from a stream. Hunger gnawed constantly, leaving men too weak to speak for long. Yet even in this misery, comradeship bound them together. A soldier who stumbled was lifted by another. A crust of bread was divided into 3 pieces instead of 1. These small acts of loyalty mattered more than orders, for they reminded the men that even in collapse they were not alone. Combat still came, though it lacked the intensity of earlier years. Allied bombardments struck with overwhelming force, scattering units before infantry advanced. German soldiers fired from ruined farmhouses or stone walls, but retreats followed swiftly. Battles were shorter now, more chaotic, and soldiers often found themselves separated, rejoining only after desperate marches through unfamiliar valleys. Nights were filled with silence heavier than shell fire. Men lay awake, listening to the faint sound of engines or distant guns, knowing that every sunrise brought them closer to surrender. Some clung to hope of survival, others simply wished for the ordeal to end. Letters from home, when they arrived, were treasures beyond value, read again and again until the paper nearly tore. To fight in Italy in the final days was not truly to fight. It was to endure the last fragments of a war already lost, waiting for the moment when weapons would finally fall silent. In those final days of the campaign, German soldiers in Italy carried themselves like men caught between duty and collapse. The war had stripped away every illusion, leaving only the raw reality of survival. They marched through valleys filled with rubble, past bridges reduced to twisted metal, and across fields where once crops had grown but now only barbed wire and shell craters remained. Every step felt heavier, not only from the weight of gear but from the knowledge that the struggle no longer held purpose. Yet discipline still bound them, and orders still came. Hold this ridge, defend that crossing, resist for as long as possible. To refuse was unthinkable, for punishment was certain, and comrades depended on each other too deeply to falter. Hunger was a constant torment. Rations had shrunk to nearly nothing, forcing soldiers to forage in abandoned gardens or share what little civilians could spare. A crust of bread was a feast, a sip of wine a moment of forgotten peace. Cigarettes, once plentiful, had become treasures traded carefully, lit only on nights when darkness offered shelter. Illness spread quickly, with fevers and coughs leaving men weak and unsteady. Medical care was almost non-existent, and many soldiers simply pressed on despite pain. In this atmosphere, small acts of kindness took on immense weight. A soldier offering half his ration, another carrying a comrade's pack, or a word of reassurance before battle. These gestures kept spirits alive when everything else seemed lost. Combat had become fragmented. Skirmishes erupted suddenly and ended just as quickly, with German soldiers firing from stone walls or ruined barns before slipping away under pressure. The great battles of earlier years had been replaced by a constant rhythm of resistance and retreat. The Allies advanced steadily, their superiority clear in every clash, yet still the Germans held out, buying time even as they knew the larger war was collapsing elsewhere. Nights were filled with a silence that pressed on the heart. Soldiers lay awake under the cold stars, listening to the distant rumble of artillery and wondering if tomorrow would bring surrender or another march. In rare quiet moments they spoke of home, of meals remembered, of families left behind, of futures uncertain. To fight in Italy at this stage was no longer truly to fight but to endure, to carry on through hunger, exhaustion, and despair, waiting for the moment when the war that had consumed their youth would finally come to its end. As April 1945 reached its last days, the German soldiers in Italy felt the world around them shrinking. The front no longer stretched endlessly forward. Instead, it seemed to close in on itself, pressing them northward with every Allied push. They were exhausted beyond words, their uniforms threadbare, their boots patched with rags, their weapons carried more out of obligation than hope. Marches dragged on for hours, through valleys echoing with artillery and across bridges hastily rebuilt, only to be destroyed again. Each step was accompanied by the thought that there might not be another line to retreat to. Still, the orders came: hold the ridges, delay the enemy, resist until told otherwise. These commands no longer inspired, but they provided structure, something to cling to in a world dissolving into chaos. The soldiers followed because discipline was the last thing left unbroken. Food was scarcer than ever. Meals consisted of a crust of bread or a ladle of watery soup, shared carefully among comrades. Hunger hollowed cheeks and weakened limbs, yet the men pressed forward, their survival depending on one another. Cigarettes, once traded lightly, had become rare treasures, sometimes kept unlit for days until the moment felt worthy enough to burn the last one. Illness spread without restraint. Coughs echoed through dugouts, and fevers struck men too tired to resist. Those who collapsed were often left behind, tended to only if there was time, which there rarely was. And yet in these dark days humanity endured in fragments. A soldier carrying a comrade's rifle when he could no longer lift it. A laugh shared over some memory of home. A letter read aloud until the paper nearly tore. These moments were fragile but powerful, a reminder that even in collapse they were still more than shadows of war. Combat itself had lost its sharpness. No longer sweeping offensives but scattered clashes, sudden bursts of gunfire in villages or fields, followed by retreats into the next valley. The Allies pressed steadily, their planes ruling the skies, their artillery raining down with unrelenting force. German soldiers dug shelters into hillsides, clinging to the land because there was nowhere else to go. Nights carried a heavy silence, broken only by the distant thunder of guns. Men lay awake staring at the stars, wondering if they would live to see another sunrise. To fight in Italy in these final days was to exist on the edge of surrender, driven not by victory but by endurance, waiting for the moment when silence would finally replace the guns. By the final week of April 1945, German soldiers in Italy marched like men caught between two worlds, one still ruled by duty and another already sensing the war's end. The mountains and valleys that had once felt endless now seemed smaller, as if each step northward carried them closer to a breaking point. They were thin from hunger, their faces lined by fatigue, their uniforms ragged and patched. Boots, worn to shreds, were wrapped with cloth or rope to keep them together. Weapons were carried still, but ammunition was scarce, and soldiers knew that every bullet had to count. Orders remained the same: delay, defend, hold the line. But everyone understood that these commands were no longer about victory. They were about time, about slowing the inevitable, about clinging to some sense of control in a war slipping away. Food was almost gone. Rations consisted of hard bread, sometimes mouldy, and water from streams that left men sick. Soldiers foraged in fields, searching for chestnuts, wild greens, or anything edible. Some accepted food from villagers, though often with suspicion or fear in their eyes. Cigarettes, rare as gold, were divided carefully, one passed among several men, each taking only a single breath before passing it on. Illness spread quickly in such conditions. Coughs and fevers weakened entire groups, yet medical care was nearly absent. Men pressed on despite their condition, for stopping meant being left behind. And still, comradeship endured. Soldiers helped each other march, shared scraps of food, and offered words of reassurance when silence became too heavy. These bonds mattered more than orders, for they reminded the men that they were still human in a world that seemed determined to erase humanity. Fighting continued, though it was fragmented and desperate. Allied artillery thundered across ridges, planes swept low over valleys, and infantry pushed steadily forward. German soldiers fought from ruined farmhouses, from stone walls, from dugouts carved into hillsides. They resisted fiercely, but each clash ended with another retreat, another march, another loss of ground. Nights were perhaps the hardest. Darkness was filled with silence broken only by distant engines or the whistle of shells. Men lay awake staring at the black sky, wondering if tomorrow would bring surrender, capture, or yet another battle. Some prayed for peace, others simply prayed to survive one more night. To fight in Italy in the final week of April was to live on borrowed time, caught between the discipline of duty and the quiet realization that the war at last was about to end. As April turned to its final days, German soldiers in Italy marched north through valleys already filled with the echoes of defeat. They knew the larger war was collapsing, but still the orders came: hold the rivers, defend the ridges, resist for as long as possible. These instructions no longer carried the promise of strategy. They were simply motions to be followed, fragments of discipline that kept exhausted men moving. Every step of the retreat was marked by hunger. Rations had shrunk to almost nothing, forcing soldiers to scour abandoned farms for potatoes or wild herbs. A crust of bread was divided among 3 men, and even that seemed like a blessing. Water was taken from muddy ditches or icy streams, sometimes leaving soldiers sick but with no other choice. Weakness spread through the ranks, and yet the march continued, because to stop meant to fall behind. The land around them was beautiful and cruel at once. Spring blossoms appeared on trees, fields shimmered with green, and the mountains glowed under sunlight, but soldiers saw it all through tired eyes. To them the colours seemed unreal, a world still alive while they stumbled through the ruins of war. Villages stood in silence, their streets filled with rubble, their people thin and wary. Some civilians turned away, others offered bread or water in quiet gestures that stayed in memory longer than any battle. The fighting itself had become scattered, almost desperate. Allied artillery rumbled constantly, shaking the ground, while aircraft circled overhead. German units dug shallow defences in fields or hid in farmhouses, firing as long as they could before pulling back. Skirmishes ended quickly, with little gained except another delay. Weapons grew scarce, ammunition nearly gone, and many soldiers carried rifles with only a handful of rounds left. In truth, they fought now less for the cause and more for the man beside them, for comradeship was the last strength left unbroken. Nights were filled with silence that pressed on the heart. Soldiers lay awake in barns or under the stars, listening to the wind rustling through trees and wondering if the next dawn would be their last in uniform. Some wrote final lines in diaries, others whispered prayers, and many simply stared into darkness, too tired even for thought. To fight in Italy at this moment was to walk on the edge of surrender, where the weight of hunger, exhaustion, and inevitability grew heavier with each passing hour, and where every sunrise felt like both a burden and a fragile gift of survival. By the final days of April 1945, German soldiers in Italy felt as though they were marching through the end of the world. The land around them carried scars of years of fighting, bridges broken, roads cratered, villages abandoned or reduced to rubble. Every step forward felt heavier, for their strength was almost gone. Many soldiers walked in silence, too tired to speak, their faces drawn thin, their eyes hollow. Hunger gnawed constantly, their stomachs empty, their bodies weak. A single crust of bread or a sip of wine could carry a man through another day, but such moments were rare. Still, they marched, because marching was the only choice left. Orders continued to arrive, though they felt detached from reality. Defend this ridge, hold that valley, delay at all costs. Soldiers obeyed out of habit more than belief, knowing that these commands could not change the inevitable. Ammunition was nearly gone. Some men carried rifles with only a handful of cartridges, others had none at all, relying on bayonets or captured weapons. Artillery support was scarce, and the skies belonged to Allied planes that roared overhead with impunity. Battles erupted suddenly and ended just as quickly, German units scattering under bombardments before pulling back again. Resistance was no longer measured in victories but in hours gained. Among comrades, bonds held firm. Soldiers leaned on each other during marches, shared scraps of food, and offered quiet words of comfort when silence grew too heavy. These small acts mattered more than strategy, for they gave meaning in a world where everything else was slipping away. Civilians watched them pass, their faces etched with war's bitterness. Some offered water or bread, others turned away in silence, and a few looked on with anger. The soldiers carried these glances with them, reminders of the suffering that touched everyone caught in the campaign. Nights were the hardest. Darkness brought silence, broken only by distant artillery or the rumble of engines. Soldiers lay awake under stars, staring into the black sky, wondering if they would live to see peace. Some prayed for survival, others for release, and many simply wished for an end. To fight in Italy in these last days was to endure beyond endurance, to carry on when strength had already failed, and to march toward a future none could see clearly. The end was close. Every man felt it. But until the moment arrived, they continued forward, step by weary step, into the closing shadow of war. As April faded into its final hours, German soldiers in Italy carried themselves like shadows of the men who had first arrived nearly 2 years earlier. They had marched across mountains, defended valleys, and endured winters of rain and snow, but now they were hollowed out by exhaustion. Uniforms were threadbare, boots torn, helmets dented, rifles worn smooth from endless use. Hunger had stripped them thin, leaving faces sharp and eyes dulled by fatigue. Yet still they marched, because habit and duty drove them forward even when hope had long since gone. Orders came with the same words as always: delay, defend, resist. But everyone knew their meaning had changed. They were no longer steps toward victory, only measures to slow the end. Ammunition was almost gone, food scarce to the point of nothing. Soldiers searched fields for roots or wild herbs, begged bread from villagers, and drank from streams that made them ill. Every day was a struggle not against the enemy alone, but against weakness of body. Still, comradeship remained. Men carried each other's gear, shared crumbs of bread, and kept each other moving when legs threatened to give out. These bonds were stronger than any command, for they gave reason to continue when the war itself had lost all sense. Combat came in flashes now. A sudden shelling, a burst of gunfire from advancing allies, a skirmish in a ruined village. German soldiers fought fiercely when pressed, but retreats followed quickly, each one leaving them further north, closer to the inevitable. They no longer thought in terms of battles won or lost, only in terms of hours survived. The land itself seemed to speak of endings. Spring flowers bloomed across hillsides, streams sparkled in the sun, and birds sang again, but soldiers passed without noticing. Beauty felt cruel, a reminder of the world beyond war that they could not touch. Villages were hushed, their people wary, some offering quiet kindness, others only stares heavy with blame. Nights were the hardest of all. Soldiers lay in barns, trenches, or open fields, staring at stars that seemed brighter than ever in the dark Italian sky. Thoughts turned inward, families left behind, homes far away, memories of peace that felt more like dreams than truths. Some wrote final words in notebooks, others whispered prayers, and many simply let silence fill them. To fight in Italy in these last hours was to exist in a fragile space between war and surrender, between the weight of duty and the hope of survival. Every sunrise felt like it might be the last seen as soldiers, and every step forward carried them closer to the end they all felt approaching. In the opening days of May 1945, the German soldiers in Italy reached the final chapter of their long ordeal. Rumours had already spread that the war was over in the north, that armies elsewhere had surrendered, but on the line they still carried rifles and still received orders. The contradiction was almost unbearable. The knowledge that the struggle was lost, and yet the demand to fight another day. Men obeyed because discipline was all they had left, though each step felt heavier, each shot fired emptier. The land they marched through bore every scar of the campaign. Roads were shattered, villages reduced to rubble, and bridges broken so many times they seemed symbolic of the war itself. Rebuilt briefly, destroyed again, never whole. The men themselves looked like fragments as well. Boots tied with rope, uniforms patched until they were more cloth than original fabric, bodies thin from hunger and exhaustion. Their eyes carried the weight of years, though many were still barely older than 20. Hunger gnawed constantly. Rations were gone, and soldiers survived on whatever they could find. Wild herbs, chestnuts, scraps begged from civilians who had little themselves. Illness spread quickly. Fevers, coughs, stomach sickness. Medical care was almost non-existent, and men simply carried on until they collapsed. Yet in these last days, comradeship remained their anchor. A piece of bread shared, a canteen passed, a hand steadying another on a climb. These acts mattered more than any strategy. The bonds between them gave meaning in a world where orders no longer did. Fighting itself had become scattered, almost symbolic. Allied bombardments thundered with overwhelming force, infantry advanced with confidence, and German soldiers fired back as long as they could before retreating once more. Each clash ended the same. Another position abandoned, another night of marching, another day survived. Some soldiers admitted quietly that they no longer fought the enemy but simply fought against time, holding out until the war finally ended. Nights were filled with a silence deeper than shell fire. Lying under the stars, soldiers spoke of home, of families they longed to see, of peace that seemed both near and unreachable. Some prayed, others stayed silent, and many simply stared into the dark, too tired for words. To fight in Italy in May 1945 was to exist in the shadow of surrender, where every order felt like an echo, and every step carried them closer to laying down arms. The end was coming, and every man felt it in his bones, yet until it arrived they endured, carrying the weight of war to its final breath. The first week of May 1945 was unlike any other for the German soldiers in Italy. It was a time suspended between war and peace, between orders and surrender, between fear and relief. Official announcements had not yet reached every unit, but rumours travelled faster than commands. Soldiers whispered of capitulation in the north, of generals negotiating terms, of armies laying down arms. Yet on the line they still marched, still carried rifles, and still received the same orders: defend, delay, resist. The contradiction weighed heavily, for men knew deep inside that there was nothing left to win. Their bodies mirrored the exhaustion of the campaign. Uniforms hung loose on starved frames, boots patched with rope, helmets dented and scratched from years of service. Rifles were carried like burdens rather than weapons, often with only a handful of rounds left. Ammunition had grown so scarce that some men counted every shot as if it were their last. Food was almost gone. Soldiers survived on crumbs of bread, boiled greens, or whatever they could beg from civilians. Hunger was constant, gnawing at strength, dulling thought, and leaving men hollow-eyed. Illness weakened them further, with fevers and coughs spreading unchecked. And yet, in this collapse, comradeship burned stronger than ever. A soldier who stumbled was lifted by another. Water was passed from canteen to canteen, no matter how little remained. These small acts of loyalty were the last defence against despair. Battles in those final days felt less like combat and more like gestures. Allied artillery thundered, planes roared overhead, and infantry pressed forward with determination. German soldiers fired when they could, but retreats followed quickly, sometimes without resistance at all. For many, fighting had ceased to be about holding ground. It was about preserving dignity, about not abandoning comrades, about carrying duty until the very last order was given. Civilians watched with guarded eyes. Some offered quiet kindness, a cup of water, a loaf of bread, while others turned away, too weary of war to show sympathy. The land itself seemed to echo with contradiction. Spring blossoms filled the valleys, rivers sparkled in sunlight, and yet soldiers trudged through it all like ghosts too broken to notice. Nights were filled with silence deeper than gunfire. Men lay awake in barns, in ruined houses, or under the stars, listening to the distant thunder of artillery and wondering if dawn would bring another order, or the long-awaited command to stop. To fight in Italy in that first week of May was to exist in a fragile pause, caught between the weight of duty and the quiet certainty that the end was already here. By May 2nd, 1945, the news could no longer be ignored. Word spread among German soldiers in Italy that a surrender had been signed. Some heard it from officers, others from civilians, and many simply from whispers travelling faster than orders. Yet even with this knowledge, confusion lingered. Some commanders insisted their men hold positions until official confirmation arrived, while others quietly told units to prepare to lay down arms. For the soldiers themselves, the moment was surreal. After years of marching, digging, fighting and retreating, the end had arrived not with a final great battle, but with a silence that felt almost unreal. They had expected the end to be marked by thunder, by a collapse of fire and smoke, yet instead it came softly, in rumours and hesitant commands. The men themselves were exhausted to the core. Their bodies were thin, their clothes in tatters, their weapons worn. Ammunition was nearly gone, food almost non-existent. Hunger hollowed their faces and illness weakened their steps. Many were too tired to celebrate, too drained even to speak of relief. They simply sat in silence, trying to absorb the meaning of it all. For some, the thought of survival brought sudden waves of emotion, joy, disbelief, even fear of what came next. For others, it felt empty, as though the war had taken so much from them that even peace could not fill the void. Civilians reacted in different ways. Some wept with relief, others greeted the end with quiet dignity, while a few looked at the soldiers with bitterness, seeing only the uniforms that had brought years of suffering. German soldiers accepted this in silence, knowing that nothing they could say would change those feelings. Comradeship was the one constant that held. Men shared their last pieces of bread, their last cigarettes, their last words of encouragement. Some wrote quick notes in diaries, others carved names into walls or trees, leaving behind small marks of their presence. They knew that soon they would be marched into captivity, that their lives would change again, but for now they were together in the strange pause between war and peace. The land seemed to breathe with them. Spring flowers bloomed across valleys. Rivers flowed quietly under bridges still broken from battle, and the mountains stood as silent witnesses to all that had passed. To fight in Italy ended not with victory or defeat, but with surrender, a moment both heavy and light, filled with exhaustion and quiet relief. For the German soldiers, it meant the struggle was finally over, though the memories of it would remain forever. When the order finally came to lay down arms, German soldiers in Italy experienced a silence unlike any they had ever known. For years their lives had been measured in artillery strikes, rifle fire, and the constant rumble of engines. Now, for the first time, there was nothing. The mountains that had echoed with war were quiet. The valleys carried only the sound of wind and water. Men who had once reacted to every whistle of a shell or crack of a rifle now sat still, rifles resting across their knees, waiting for instructions that no longer commanded them to fight. Some lowered their weapons with shaking hands, unable to believe the war was truly over. Others held on a moment longer, as though letting go meant admitting that everything they had endured was now behind them. The act of surrender was not dramatic. It came in small, simple gestures, rifles stacked in piles, helmets removed, ammunition handed over. Soldiers stood in lines, thin and weary, their faces etched with exhaustion. There was no cheer, No relief loud enough to be heard, only quiet, broken by murmured words between comrades. For many, the moment brought memories rushing back. Marches through mud, nights without food, comrades lost on distant hills. The weight of those memories pressed heavier than the rifles they now gave away. Civilians watched with mixed emotions. Some were relieved to see the uniforms gone, others stared with bitterness, and a few offered cautious kindness, water, bread, even silence as a sign of respect for men who were, in the end, human like themselves. The soldiers accepted it all with bowed heads. Their hunger was too great, their fatigue too deep to resist any longer. Comradeship remained their anchor. Men leaned on one another, whispered final words of encouragement, shared cigarettes or scraps of bread. They did not know what captivity would bring, but they knew they would face it together. The land itself seemed to shift with the change. Villages once filled with gunfire were now filled with silence. Fields bloomed with spring flowers, rivers flowed undisturbed, and the mountains stood watch as if marking the end of one age and the beginning of another. For German soldiers, surrender in Italy was not just the end of fighting, it was the end of a journey through exhaustion, hunger, and fear. It was the moment when survival no longer depended on weapons, but on endurance of memory. And though peace had come, they understood that the war would live on inside them long after the guns had fallen silent. The surrender did not end with a single moment. It unfolded slowly, like a heavy curtain being drawn across the stage of war. German soldiers in Italy gathered in fields, on roadsides, in villages half destroyed by shells. Officers relayed the terms, their voices quiet, their faces as worn as those of the men they commanded. Rifles were stacked neatly into piles, machine guns dismantled, ammunition collected into crates. The weapons that had defined their existence were left behind, and with them went a part of the identity each soldier had carried for years. For some, this was relief. For others, a hollow emptiness. They had fought, marched, suffered, and endured, and now all that was asked of them was to stop. Captivity followed quickly. Allied soldiers appeared not as enemies in battle, but as guards, organising lines of prisoners and directing them to collection points. The German soldiers, too weak to resist, obeyed without question. Their boots scraped against the dirt roads, their uniforms hanging loosely from thin frames, their faces pale from hunger. Some stumbled and were helped by comrades, others leaned on sticks or clutched blankets around their shoulders. The march into captivity was silent, broken only by the sound of footsteps and the occasional command. Civilians lined the roads in places. Some looked on with quiet relief, others with bitterness, and a few with pity. Children stared wide-eyed at the long columns of weary men. Now stripped of their weapons, the soldiers looked less like an occupying force and more like wanderers who had lost their way. For the men themselves, emotions were complicated. There was no triumph, but there was no despair either. Only a numb recognition that the long struggle had ended. Some thought of home with sudden sharpness, wondering if they would ever see it again. Others thought of comrades lost along the way, and how surrender felt like an unfinished story. Yet among them, the bond of comradeship remained. Prisoners shared water, offered quiet words of encouragement, and walked side by side into the unknown. The land around them seemed transformed. Where once there had been the constant echo of war, there was now only the sound of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the steady rhythm of feet. Spring was in full bloom, flowers bright against the ruins, as if nature itself was eager to cover the scars left behind. For the German soldiers, surrender in Italy was not only the end of fighting, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one marked by uncertainty, captivity, and the slow process of understanding what peace meant after so many years of war. The first days of captivity were a strange mixture of relief and fear for the German soldiers in Italy. They were no longer under fire, no longer digging trenches or marching endlessly toward the next defensive line. Yet the uncertainty of what awaited them weighed heavily. Columns of prisoners stretched along the roads, guarded by Allied soldiers who gave short commands and kept a steady watch. For the first time in years, the German soldiers no longer carried weapons. Their hands were empty, their belts lighter, their steps unsure. Some felt as if a burden had been lifted, while others felt stripped of their very identity. Hunger still clung to them. Allied rations began to appear, sometimes distributed in small portions, bread, canned meat, or biscuits. To men who had survived on scraps, these meals felt like feasts, though many ate slowly, their stomachs unaccustomed to real food. Water was plentiful, and for the first time in months soldiers drank until they were satisfied. Exhaustion followed quickly, and men slept deeply on the ground, their helmets used as pillows, their rifles long since surrendered. Sleep was no longer interrupted by shell fire, but by dreams too vivid to ignore. Many woke with memories of battles flashing through their minds, of comrades lost, of long marches through mud and snow. Captivity did not erase the war. It only gave space for those memories to surface. Among comrades, bonds grew even stronger. Prisoners shared food, blankets, and stories, reassuring one another that survival was still possible. Some spoke of home, of families far away, of hopes for letters or eventual release. Others remained silent, too overwhelmed by exhaustion to find words. Civilians sometimes watched the columns of prisoners with mixed emotions. Some offered bread or water, gestures of simple humanity. Others looked on with bitterness, seeing in the uniforms only the years of hardship the war had brought. The soldiers accepted both reactions in silence. The land, too, seemed to change. Without the constant thunder of artillery, the valleys echoed only with footsteps, the songs of birds, and the murmurs of prisoners walking into the unknown. Spring blossoms filled the fields, rivers ran clear, and the mountains stood silent, as if reclaiming their peace. For the German soldiers, captivity marked the true end of the campaign. They were no longer fighters but survivors, carried forward not by orders but by the will to endure whatever came next. The war in Italy was over, but the memory of what it had meant to fight there would remain with them always. As the days of captivity turned into weeks, German soldiers in Italy began to understand the new rhythm of their lives. The march had stopped, the battles were behind them, and now their world was defined by fences, guards, and routines. Prisoner-of-war camps were hastily set up in fields, barns, or former military installations, where thousands of weary men gathered together. For many, the simple act of sleeping without fear of shell fire was a strange relief. Yet alongside that relief was uncertainty. No one knew how long captivity would last, or what awaited them when it finally ended. Meals came more regularly, though they were plain: bread, beans, soup, sometimes canned meat. To men who had starved for months, this food seemed abundant, though it never fully erased the hunger carved into their bodies. Water was clean and plentiful, and soldiers drank as though trying to wash the war from their throats. Slowly, strength began to return, though exhaustion lingered deep within. The camp atmosphere was heavy with memories. Groups of soldiers sat together, sharing stories of battles, of marches through mud and snow, of nights spent under the roar of artillery. Others spoke of home, of families left behind, of farms, shops, or schools that now felt like distant dreams. Some avoided conversation altogether, staring at the ground, lost in thoughts they could not share. The bond of comradeship remained strong. Prisoners supported each other through illness, shared cigarettes when they appeared, and comforted those overcome with despair. In these small acts they found dignity, even within captivity. Civilians sometimes came near the camps. Some offered kindness, bringing food or clothing. Others looked with bitterness, unable to forgive the years of suffering the soldiers' presence had caused. The prisoners accepted both reactions quietly, aware that the war had left wounds that food and words could not heal. The land itself began to reclaim its peace. Spring rains washed over the hills, flowers bloomed in meadows, and the mountains stood silent, no longer echoing with battle. From within the camps, soldiers could see this renewal, a reminder that the world outside was moving forward while they remained behind fences. For them, the campaign in Italy had ended not in triumph or even defeat, but in surrender and captivity. Yet as they lay beneath the open sky at night, they carried with them every memory of what it had meant to fight in that land, memories of hunger and hardship, of comradeship and endurance, of survival in a campaign that seemed endless until it was finally over. As weeks of captivity passed, the German soldiers in Italy began to look back on the campaign with a clarity they had never known during the fighting. In the trenches and on the marches, there had been no time to think, only to act, to endure the next order, the next bombardment, the next climb up a mountain path. Now, behind fences and under guard, memories surfaced one after another. Men spoke quietly of nights when rain filled their dugouts until they nearly drowned in mud, of days when the sun baked them on ridges until they could barely stand, of rivers crossed under fire, of comrades left behind in villages reduced to rubble. Every man carried his own story, and together those stories built the picture of what it had truly meant to fight in Italy. Hunger was remembered most sharply. Soldiers recalled tearing stale bread into small pieces to make it last, sharing single potatoes between 3 men, or drinking from streams that left them sick but alive. They remembered the way their stomachs cramped during marches, the weakness in their legs, the dizziness that came from nothing in their bellies but determination. Exhaustion was another constant memory. Marches that never seemed to end, nights without sleep, bodies trembling from cold or heat yet forced onward by commands that allowed no pause. Some admitted they had not truly slept in years, only dozed in fragments, helmets on, boots still laced, rifles always within reach. Yet alongside the hunger and exhaustion, men remembered comradeship. They spoke of cigarettes passed from hand to hand, of laughter shared even in ruins, of a soldier lifting another when he could no longer walk. These bonds had been stronger than fear, stronger even than orders, for they reminded the men that they were not alone. Now, in captivity, that bond remained their greatest comfort. The land itself lingered in their memories. The hills and valleys, both cruel and beautiful, had shaped every battle, every march. Soldiers recalled the silence before dawn, the sight of mist rising from rivers, the glow of sunsets over ruined villages. Italy had been both battlefield and prison, a place of suffering and endurance, but also of strange, fleeting beauty that stayed in memory even when war tried to erase it. As they sat in camps, staring at the mountains from behind fences, the German soldiers knew that Italy had marked them forever. To fight there had been to live at the edge of survival, and to survive was to carry those memories into whatever future awaited them. In the final weeks of their captivity, German soldiers in Italy realized that their war had truly ended. The guns were silent, the marches had stopped, and the orders that had once dictated every moment of their lives were gone. Yet the silence carried its own weight. It was not the peace they had imagined during endless nights in trenches. It was quieter, heavier, filled with memories that refused to fade. Each man carried a private archive of the campaign, images of ruined villages, rivers crossed under fire, comrades falling beside them, the taste of stale bread shared on a cold hillside. In conversations around campfires, they pieced together the story of their struggle, not as generals or strategists would tell it, but as men who had lived it step by step. They remembered the first marches through Sicily, the endless climbs into the Apennines, the winters of mud and rain, the summers of dust and heat. They spoke of the fatigue that pressed down like an invisible weight, of hunger that made every movement an effort, of the constant watchfulness that turned even sleep into another form of waiting. and always, they remembered comradeship. The campaign had been built not on victories but on endurance, and endurance had been possible only because men had leaned on one another. A hand steadying a comrade during a climb, a cigarette passed before battle, a word of reassurance whispered in the dark. These were the true foundations of their survival. Now, in captivity, those bonds held them together still, even as uncertainty about the future loomed. Some wondered if they would return home, if their town still stood, if their families had survived. Others feared the long years of imprisonment ahead, yet all understood that the war they had fought in Italy would remain with them forever. The land itself seemed etched into their memory. They would never forget the sight of mist curling over valleys at dawn, or the silence of villages emptied by shell fire, or the way the mountains stood unbroken, indifferent to the armies that had bled across their slopes. Italy had been both enemy and companion, a place of suffering and strange beauty that had shaped their lives as surely as the war itself. For the German soldiers, to fight in Italy had meant to endure hunger, exhaustion, and fear, but also to discover the strength of comradeship and the resilience of the human spirit. And as they looked out from behind the fences of captivity, they knew that though the campaign was over, its memory would walk with them always, quiet, heavy, unshakable, like the echo of distant guns carried forever in the heart.